The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker,
Order.
Mr. Speaker, I forget who it was who used the simile of being savaged by a dead sheep. I understand now, after that performance, exactly what the person meant. Mr. Speaker, let's clinically examine the observations made by the Leader of the Opposition under the 5 headings to which he has gone. He has constructed.
I warn the member for Mallee.
Mr. Speaker, he has constructed an attack on the basis of a false premise. You would notice, Mr. Speaker, how terrified I am by this attack that has been mounted by the Deputy Prime Minister. The whole foundation of this attack that's been made upon me by the Leader of the Opposition is that the Deputy Prime Minister has now made the grand attack upon the Prime Minister, that this is all part of a carefully calculated plot to undermine the Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I only hope that the Leader of the Opposition and those behind him and those advising him will keep on thinking in that way, because if their thinking is that distorted, they'll continue in this parliament to be as ineffective as they have in the previous 3. Mr. Speaker, let's examine the question of whether this government has a particular policy which it's put to the people, and which it has and will continue to pursue, which seems to be at the forefront of the Leader of the Opposition's attack. We have just, of course, come through an election where the people had the opportunity of making a decision as between the policies which I put forward on behalf of this party and this government for the conduct of economic policy and the future direction of this country, or the position of those opposite. And it is true, as the Leader of the Opposition said, one of the few accurate things he had to say, that I did say and repeat during that campaign with very considerable effect, I believe, that if a party is not capable of governing itself, then it is not capable of governing the country. And indeed, the people of this country, in very, very difficult economic circumstances, with very high interest rates, where indeed they were suffering from the application of tough economic policy by this government, found the alternative absolutely wanting. And they found it wanting because they saw an opposition, Mr. Speaker, who had no idea of what was involved in formulating policy for this country. That was evident, Mr. Speaker, in so many different areas of their affairs, but in no particular area more obvious than it was in regard to health. They'd had 7 years in opposition, Mr. Speaker, and so deep are their divisions, and, Mr. Speaker, that is not only within the Liberal Party, but between the Liberal Party and the National Party, that in 7 years they were not able to go to the Australian people with any policy at all in that area. Now, Mr. Speaker, from that position, the Leader of the Opposition seeks to draw some analogy between the events of recent days and since the election. Mr. Speaker, I do not attempt to disguise the fact that I can draw no comfort from the observations of an ex-minister. It's no pleasure to me to hear Senator Walsh saying the things about the government in general, or about me in particular. I would be indeed a very strange Prime Minister if I was to get up and say, well, I'm very pleased about the things that Senator Walsh has got to say. But let me make this point to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, that insofar as he attempted in this speech to support C and D of his censure resolution by referring to the observations of Senator Walsh, they are absolutely irrelevant, because Senator Walsh is no longer a minister, and in that sense his remarks are to be seen not as conflicting observations upon the policy coming from a minister. Now, Mr. Speaker, nor would it be sensible of me, Mr. Speaker, to say, nor do I say, that I find any particular comfort or joy in the fact that the Deputy Prime Minister found it necessary to make the comments he did today. But, Mr. Speaker, I understand the sense in which he made them and the reason why he made them. Because, Mr. Speaker, if you were to look at the comments that were made and what was read into the comments by Senator Button, you would have been left with the impression that indeed there were others who were ahead of the Treasurer and the Prime Minister in their concern, Mr. Speaker, for the pace of reform in this country. Let me, Mr. Speaker, just very briefly indicate to the House and to the Leader of the Opposition the order of achievement in the period in the period before this fourth Hawke Labor government, which is the source of the pride which the Treasurer has and which I share, and which led him to make the observations he did. Mr. Speaker, just let me mention these things and we will hear this stupid laughter coming from opposite, but none of that stupid laughter, Mr. Speaker, can in any sense refute any one of the facts which I now put. Facts of achievement during the third term. In that period, Mr. Speaker, Australia had record business investment levels, of which everyone in this country can be proud, and they were record business levels which were created by the explicit policies of this government. Very simple, Mr. Speaker, what we achieved was very considerable real wage restraint. That led to higher profit levels which went into record investment levels. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, Australia achieved its first public sector surplus, and that was the first time in the history of this government, in the history of this country. Mr. Speaker, beforehand, when all those years of Conservative government, never once had you been able to achieve a public sector surplus. But we did it in the last government. We did it once, we did it again, and then we did it the third time. And, Mr. Speaker, as a result of that, of course, it follows that the government made no call on the nation's savings. Next, Mr. Speaker, we cut company tax rates from 49 cents to 39 cents. Next, Mr. Speaker, we reorganised the taxation of superannuation. Next, Mr. Speaker, we cut tariffs by around 30%. And if you look at the whole post-war history of this country, Mr. Speaker, there have only been 2 occasions on which tariffs have been cut, and both by Labor governments, by 25% under the previous Labor government and 33% by us 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. Next, Mr. Speaker, we lowered assistance to sugar, tobacco, dried vine, fruits and citrus industries. Next, we subjected many areas of telecommunication to competition, areas such as value-added services and customer premises equipment. Next, Mr. Speaker, we established a new independent telecommunications regulatory body, Austel. Next, we deregulated domestic aviation, the product of your period of government, that cosy little relationship, the 2 airlines agreement. It was this government during its last term which brought that to an end. Next, Mr. Speaker, we freed up oil pricing and marketing. Next, we brought in important reforms to government business enterprises. Next, we introduced vital reforms in grain handling, and we did it over the opposition of the Conservative parties in this country. Next, Mr. Speaker, we made major changes to the Industrial Relations Act. Not all of you, there were some of you who saw the light. But we didn't have any problem on our side. The problem was between the Liberal Party and the National Party. Mr. Speaker, we made...
The member for McKellar.
We made major changes to the Industrial Relations Act. We oversaw the introduction of award restructuring, and we introduced major coastal shipping and waterfront reforms. In regard to coastal shipping, Mr. Speaker, we'll have the situation where, as a result of the reforms brought about under this government in the last term, without losing one day to industrial disputation, in 1992 we'll have manning levels and coastal shipping in this country equal to the OECD average. Now, Mr. Speaker, when you look at that list of achievements, is it any wonder that the Treasurer is somewhat concerned by some suggestion that we'd been dragging the chain? At the end of last year, I issued a challenge to you fellows, and there has been the thundering silence ever since. I asked you if you really were the custodians of some philosophy and some commitment to microeconomic reform. You would presumably be able to answer my challenge, which was very explicit. You tell me once within your period of government when you came within a bull's roar of that record of microeconomic achievement. And there's still the thundering silence to that challenge which I put to you at the end of last year. You can't do it, and you can't do it for the simple reason, one, that you didn't do it, but secondly, it was not an accident that in all your period in office you didn't do anything about microeconomic reform. It's because you've got neither the wit, the wisdom, the guts, or the facility to deal with the Australian community to bring those results about. So it's little wonder that my friend and colleague, the Deputy Prime Minister, was a little bit upset when one of his colleagues made statements which carried some sort of assumption that this government had been dragging the chain in the area of microeconomic reform, because the Treasurer, with myself, have been right up there at the forefront of ensuring that third Hawke government had done more in the area of microeconomic reform than had ever been done before. But we weren't satisfied with that. because during the election campaign, Mr Speaker, I gave my specific commitment to 10 future areas of microeconomic reform during the fourth Hawke Labor government. So those are the facts, Mr Speaker, a record of unparalleled achievement and a commitment, Mr Speaker, to ensure that in the next term we would proceed. Now, Mr Speaker, I go quickly to some of the other matters that were picked up, that were mentioned by the Leader of the Opposition. He had the unbelievable gall, Mr Speaker, to say that my friend and colleague, the Treasurer, had gone outside the Parliament to make some statements about certain economic matters. Now, let me make these two comments in particular in regard to that charge. Two comments and two telling comments. When the Treasurer made his address at the Press Club, he wasn't announcing a change of government policy. In the election campaign, Mr Speaker, our position was crystal clear. No consumption tax in the fourth Hawke Labor government. So he didn't go to the Press Club and announce a change in policy. It was those opposite, outside the Parliament, who changed their position. During the election campaign, they had told the people of Australia, our position, no consumption tax. But then when they got devastated for the fourth time in the election campaign and all the wheels got turning and all the cans of worms were moving about, they decided that they would have a change of position. Did they wait to come into the Parliament to tell the people about their change of policy? Of course they didn't. They did it outside. But if we're talking about changes of position, then the Leader of the Opposition might face up to this question. And I'll remind him of what he said on the 3rd of August 1987 in an interview in The Age. I'm on record advocating a broad-based consumption tax as an essential part of an overall reform of taxation. I haven't changed my view on that. Fair enough, we accept that. But interestingly, he went on. On capital gains and fringe benefits, Hewson says, quote, I'd go for near uniform taxation of all forms of income. In other words, if we're talking about constancy and non-change, perhaps the Leader of the Opposition will deign at some time to tell this House why and under what pressures he has done a U-turn on the question of a capital gains tax. When he was speaking as an unencumbered Professor of Economics, unpressured by the conservative forces of privilege in the Liberal Party and the National Party, he had a clear view that to have a capital gains tax was right, that once he gets into the Parliament and becomes subject to the pressures of privilege so indelicately manipulated in the Liberal Party, all the crystal clarity of thinking of the Professor of Economics goes down the drain and he becomes what he obviously easily is, an easily manipulated figure of the forces of privilege in the Liberal Party. So he has got no attack upon the Deputy Prime Minister, but he's certainly got a case to answer in regard to his total U-turn. A capital gains tax, yes, economically correct when he's a Professor of Economics, telling the truth as he sees it, but now, no, I will just go along and be the easy tool of those who want to prop up privilege in this country. Now, Mr Speaker, in regard to Senator Tate, let me pick that up. Mr Speaker, I made it quite clear last week, as did the Attorney-General, that we believed that the judgment exercised by Senator Tate was wrong. And I criticised him. I criticised him to his face in my office, and I did so publicly. But I also said, Mr Speaker, that I believed that it was appropriate to take into account the whole circumstances. I was certain that Senator Tate did not know there was a trial, and I simply put a question to those of you on the other side of the House who are close friends of Senator Tate and who, for instance, know him in the context of the Christian Fellowship. I simply ask you the question. No, you can laugh. I'm simply saying there are those on that side of the House who know Senator Tate in that context. Do you believe that Senator Tate is not telling the truth? I believe that he is, and in the light of his record, Mr Speaker, in the light of his record, I do not believe that his sacking was warranted. I believe that he has learned his lesson and, Mr Speaker, that it will not be repeated. As to leadership, the final point, Mr Speaker, all I can say is that I've been around in public life now for more than 30 years. My capacity for leadership has been tested and successively endorsed by the Australian people.
The Prime Minister's time has expired.